and the front line, the place on which all political forecasts depend. It's tough there. Although Russian propaganda slipped up again. For example, Putin was told about the alleged encirclement of 15 battalions in Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. Our Joint Forces grouping explained that, first of all, the city is small, so it's physically impossible to encircle 15 battalions there. And besides, this video that they're spreading exposes the Russians. They're bragging about bombing Kupiansk. Only one question. Why does it look so green here? And if they've already taken it, then what are they shelling their own positions? In Kupiansk itself, our Andriy Tsaplienko says firefights are ongoing between Russian groups and Ukrainian soldiers. The occupiers are present in several parts of the city, but claims about the so-called capture of Kupiansk are false. The most difficult direction is the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya axis. The head of the Russian General Staff, Gerasimov, reported to Putin that the Russians control 70% of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian command refutes these claims. Today, the 7th Air Assault Corps reported that it has completed the clearing of the center of Pokrovsk from Russian occupiers. Thus, they thwarted the enemy's plans for further advancement. And in this episode, we can support the operational battalion of the 13th National Guard Brigade, Kartia. They are stationed in the Kharkiv direction. The fighters need a ground robotic complex. These complexes literally save lives. That's why every one of our contributions. 10, 20 or 100 hryvnias via this QR code, and the soldiers will receive ammunition, food and water, and the wounded will be evacuated. And our war correspondent, Andriy Tsaplienko, saw with his own eyes that Russia is not just exaggerating its successes, but is creating fake victories for Trump.
Ukrainian defense is at the limit of its capabilities. The Russians pay no attention to their losses, throwing fresh forces into almost every direction. Not those of the Kremlin, to convince Trump that Ukraine is close to a strategic defeat. Putin now needs a loud victory. If not a real one, then a fake one. It's enough just to raise the tricolor rag somewhere on the outskirts of Kupiansk. In fact, Russia's lies about full control over Kupiansk were refuted not only by the Ukrainian General Staff, but also by Russian war correspondents. Most of the city remains under Ukrainian control. However, the White House doesn't bother with the details, so the Russian narrative looks convincing to Trump. And we will try to find out what is really happening on the front line in one of the directions where Ukrainians have managed to stabilize the situation. Dobropilya is near Pokrovsk. The Rubizh National Guard Brigade has currently halted the occupiers' advance toward the city. All the details of the Trump administration's peace plan are unknown. However, the media are already discussing that one part of it could be the issue of Russian control over the entire Donetsk region, which the Russian army is relentlessly pounding. In other words, our forces would have to withdraw from Donetsk Oblast in exchange for other occupied territories. This has not been officially confirmed, but supposedly this is what the key point of the plan looks like. But honestly, today it's hard for me to imagine how our guys who are fighting so desperately for this city would just leave it without a fight. Russian war criminals are trying to do to Dobropilya what they've already done to Toretsk or Bakhmut. They are leveling the city to the ground with artillery. Here's a recent strike. The building is still burning. There are almost no undamaged high-rise buildings left in Dobropilya, but the occupiers continue to shell Poroyed. They want to leave no chance for Ukrainian soldiers to fortify themselves in the buildings if the Russians manage to break through here. Some analysts, including Western ones, say that the front line in Ukraine has collapsed.
No, that's not true. It's not true because a breakthrough of the front line, a collapse of the front line, is when the enemy, through raids or regular formations, can advance deep into our territory. That is out of the question. That is, even these attempts by enemy columns to storm with dozens of vehicles in the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya direction, they failed for them.
The Dobropilya direction is covered by the 4th National Guard Brigade, Rubizh. One of the most motivated battalions is the Freedom Force.
Very motivated, but you see, unfortunately, our battalion is now very exhausted, has suffered losses, because we immediately moved from the Siversky direction to Pokrovsk.
The battalion was redeployed here at the moment when the enemy managed a breakthrough spanning several kilometers. Ukraine was at risk of losing control over Dobropilya. The unit successfully completed the rescue mission. They had to advance, and the enemy's positions ended up behind Ukrainian lines. Their clearance is being coordinated from this command post, probably the closest one to the front line.
Right now the situation is more or less stabilized. There is a clear front line and we have an understanding of where our forces are and where the enemy is located. But still, every day the enemy tries to infiltrate our positions somehow, looking for the weakest points in our defenses, trying to break through and send so-called units there. Small groups, if they spot our movements along a route, they easily use 2 or 3 firing assets at the same time. They don't hesitate to send 10 to 15 fiber optic drones there.
In such conditions, delivering all vital supplies is only possible by drone. But even getting a drone to the operators at the command post is almost a special operation.
Well, you know, there are thermal images and night vision devices everywhere. And they still see everything. Even 1 extra minute can make all the difference. So we try to do everything as quickly as possible.
But they have to evacuate the wounded, so the National Guardsmen drive their armored American Max Pro at night under Russian thermal cameras, risking their own lives to save another.
Hang in there, just a bit more, damn it. Just 1 more second, buddy. 1 second, everything will be fine. We'll wrap it up, that's it. Hold on, everything will be all right.
There was a firefight with an enemy assault group. It's a severe wound. Time is running out, every minute counts.
I've lost a lot of blood. I personally took down the support structure today, just as planned. Good job, Terminator.
A much smaller percentage of injuries are actually gunshot wounds. Most injuries now come from drones and accordingly from shrapnel. Evacuation is difficult now, again because of the drones. We have to do everything possible to save the person, to make sure they survive.
Maximum preparation, minimum losses. That's the ideology of the Freedom Force Battalion. Not far from the front line, there's an improvised training ground. Mine training. The soldiers are being taught how to defend the approaches to their positions.
It was sticking out about 3 centimeters from the ground.
This kind of training is extremely important because enemy assault troops can infiltrate so deep into the rear that sometimes they even reach the mortar positions. These 2 mortarmen captured enemy assault groups in their entirety.
They were 4 deep reconnaissance soldiers. They got confused and went the wrong way. And as they say, we happened to be right there at the right moment. And together they took them prisoner.
Here is one of the Russian prisoners. Surrendered voluntarily. They fed and re-educated.
They fed and drank. And what? Who is Putin?
King.
Who is Putin?
Faggot.
Oh, re-educated, damn. Don't say that here, President. Young guys, my age, more motivated. Their task was to come right to the settlement. We captured the first group, and a few others, as I understand, hid somewhere when they realized the group wasn't responding.
They send such groups by the hundreds towards Pokrovsk and in the direction of Dobropilia. We simply don't have enough soldiers to block all their routes. Thank you. They bypass Ukrainian strongpoints, try to entrench themselves in the rear of our fighters, and the classic front line turns into separate pockets of resistance. The Pokrovsk-Dobropilia direction is the most difficult. The enemy outnumbers us by 5, sometimes even 10 times. The front line that we see on the map doesn't actually exist here. The enemy infiltrates in small groups, and sometimes even artillerymen capture servicemen. Strangely enough, in such a situation, traditional artillery does not lose its relevance, especially these modern Dita artillery systems. This system was produced in 2023. Czech manufacturers managed to combine relative simplicity of design with long range and accuracy.
The first shot, of course, won't always hit the target, because that's just a ranging shot. But the second one already starts chasing the pennies. Z.
We first met Alexander back in 2022 near Kherson. Back then he was just an ordinary infantryman, and now he's the commander of the world's most advanced serial production gun, packed with electronics.
Personally, I really enjoy it. First of all, I like it. The design is really cool, and the work itself. It can hit a squirrel in the eye. We have ammunition. We choose which one we're going to use. We create a fire mission. We shoot exclusively at assault groups. So, when, for example, the weather doesn't allow them to launch an assault at the moment, we go to some of their positions, their fallback points where they gather, and then we send 7 or 8 rounds there. There's no chance for them.
For the Czech factory that produces these, the experience of defending Dobropilia is worth its weight in gold. Real war instead of a training ground.
We came, we told them it would be better like this and it would be better like that. and now they're making new machines based on what we said. They're improving the quality of the machines.
The Russian strategy is that it's better to have a lot of cheap weapons than a few expensive, high-precision ones. Unfortunately, combined with the Kremlin's greatest resource, disposable soldiers, this strategy has proven successful. What do we need to improve the situation?
More shells, especially long-range ones, so we can hit targets 30 to 40 kilometers behind enemy lines.
But it's unclear whether the National Guard troops will be able to count on them in the new reality that our main ally is so hastily creating.
Fire! Fire!
Andriy Tsaplienko, Ilya Shinkarenko, Serhiy Parfilov, TSN Week 1+1. Marathon. United News. So what
do those 28 points of the plan, which Donald Trump is now insisting on, actually propose for ending the war? At the moment, this plan is only being published by the press, and here are a few points that are being discussed the most. Ukraine is being offered to give Russia the entire territory of Donbas, including the parts that are not currently occupied. The armed forces of Ukraine must withdraw from all areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which will become a demilitarized zone. At the same time, Russia will pay some kind of rent for Donbas, but the legal right will remain with Ukraine. This was devised in the Kremlin to bypass the need for changes to Ukraine's constitution. Crimea, which has been annexed since 2014, is also to be recognized de facto as Russian, while the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions are to be divided between Russia and Ukraine along the current front line. There is also mention of a territorial exchange, but that's negligible compared to what Moscow wants to gain without fighting. The plan calls for Ukraine to abandon its pursuit of NATO membership and prohibits the deployment of foreign troops. A reduction of the Ukrainian armed forces by half, renunciation of long-range missiles in exchange for security guarantees from the United States, official recognition of the Russian language, restoration of the Moscow Church, an immediate ceasefire only after the agreement is signed, and a prisoner exchange in the all-for-all format. Elections in Ukraine must be held within 100 days after the agreement is signed. Full amnesty for all participants in the war. International sanctions on Russia are to be gradually lifted, and it will be returned to the G7. And the cherry on top is the economic part of the plan. Direct bribery of the White House by the Kremlin, the division of Russia's frozen assets in Europe. Yes, the authors of the OES plan were so brazen that people were left speechless. At the very least, high-ranking Europeans promised to find psychiatrists for the organizer of this document, Mr. Witkoff. American senators said that, in a conversation with them, Secretary of State Rubio called this plan a Russian wish list. Although Rubio himself denies this and assures that, in addition to the Russians, previous and current proposals from Ukraine have also been taken into account. Trump reportedly is no longer insisting that everything be signed by the American holiday of Thanksgiving, that is, by next Thursday. If things go well, the White House may extend the deadline, journalists quote him as saying. Ukraine will not give the enemy any reason to say that we do not want peace, that we are the ones disrupting the process, President Zelensky stated. This week was about surviving under enormous diplomatic pressure and searching for a way out of a dark room. So, the previously planned official trips provided some support in a situation where Trump would not even bring weapons for NATO, let alone for Ukraine's needs. TSN correspondent Irina Kondrachuk traveled with the president to 4 European countries and brought back a bit of optimism.
4 countries in 4 days. How did Europeans receive Zelensky against the backdrop of a corruption scandal and an almost finalized peace plan between Russia and the USA? And also about the interests of each side and what awaits us next. Sunday morning, the presidential plane lands in Athens. Zelensky heads to a meeting with the president of Greece. People stopped along the road to raise Greek and Ukrainian flags in their hands. President Katerina Sakelaropoulou declares support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, assistance in reconstruction, and the return of Ukrainian children.
And notwithstanding the fact that Greece and Russia have had close ties, we cannot forgive the violation of borders and international law.
After the official meeting, the heads of state gas companies sign an agreement on an energy corridor from Greece to Ukraine. This is meant to cover part of the fuel lost from Ukrainian fields bombed by Russia.
The only possible way to get through this heating season is to import additional volumes. It's definitely a mix of gas from different sources, including American gas. The Greek side is providing us with credit support and offers deferred payment options.
Monday. A military base near Paris. The presidents of Ukraine and France sign a historic agreement to strengthen combat aviation with French Rafale fighter jets. It is likely that we will also pay for this with a reparations loan.
I believe that in the end, we will still be able to come to an agreement to push this issue through so that Russian assets are used specifically for the European defense package for Ukrainian production.
Volodymyr Zelensky also states that Ukraine will receive French radars, guided aerial bombs, 6 launchers, and 8 SAM-T air defense systems. This is a new generation, which, like the Patriot, will be able to shoot down ballistic missiles. France is also preparing an additional defense package to protect the skies by the end of the year.
We also jointly visited the headquarters of the multinational coalition forces in support of Ukraine. It has been operating for several weeks now under the command of France and the United Kingdom. These are security guarantees within the framework of the Coalition of the Willing. 60 planners in Paris are coordinating how to deploy forces away from the line of contact after the ceasefire.
And this is already one of Spain's defense companies. Here they showcase anti-drone systems, turrets, aerial and ground drones, long-range detection radars and munitions. What of this could end up on the Ukrainian front line? And what kind of support a country very far from the front can provide was discussed during a tête-à-tête meeting with King Felipe VI of Spain and later with Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez. As a result, statements about a Spanish aid package are being made.
This package will include 300 million for weapons, 100 million for the Pearl program, and 215 million for products for the anti-drone and radar systems.
This includes, in particular, 40 missiles for air defense and at least 615 million euros for the purchase and development of weapons and support for the energy sector. Assisting Ukraine allows Spain to play a more systematic role in NATO and elevates its geopolitical status in Europe.
Spain is the first country among European Union members to announce that 20% of the credit it receives in the SAFE program will be allocated to joint production with Ukraine. In both countries, France and Spain, there was talk of joint production of drones and other types of weapons. So from this perspective, it was a very significant visit.
The president's European tour, as well as the new agreements between countries, were planned in advance. But all of this is happening against the backdrop of Russian advances on the front and an internal political crisis. And here everyone is very cautious.
They understand that no matter what the situation is, the collapse of the power vertical in Ukraine would lead to Ukraine's defeat.
Especially after the appearance of the peace plan by Vitkov and Dmitriev. American media had already hinted at its development and emergence last week, right after the publication of the Nabu tapes. To discuss the document, the US Special Representative was supposed to meet with the Ukrainian president in Turkey, according to Reuters. But at the last moment, Trump's envoy canceled the trip. The likely reason is being reported by the media. Zelensky is not interested in discussing such a version of the agreement and arrived with a Ukrainian-European perspective. Nevertheless, Zelensky's visit to Turkey is an important demonstration of Ukraine's willingness to negotiate under any circumstances and not fall into the narrative of Kyiv doesn't want peace. In the presidential palace, Erdogan spoke with Volodymyr Zelensky for more than 2 hours. So far, the Turkish president has gone no further than recognizing Ukraine's territorial integrity and expressing readiness to provide a platform for negotiations.
Turkey wants to be not just a platform for negotiations. Turkey wants to act as a mediator. I don't think Turkey will take Russia's side. They will also be looking for various compromise options.
So glad to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming.
While Zelensky was on his tour, American high-ranking officials arrived in Ukraine. Army Minister Dan Driscoll, who is also a classmate of US Vice President Jay Devens, and Chief of Staff General Randy George. And these are the highest-ranking Pentagon officials from the Trump presidency era in Kyiv. All to study the situation on the front from the inside and officially show Zelensky the same peace plan. Vitkova Dmitrieva. The Americans are counting on Kyiv being more lenient since it is now weakened, explains Serhiy Solodky, an analyst at the New Europe Center.
It cannot be ruled out that the relevant Russian actors, players, have been whispering to Washington, to the United States, that now is the time, that a plan should be proposed which Kyiv will be forced to accept.
A traditional trap to make it look like it is Ukraine that is refusing diplomacy and not Russia in any way. And the intense pressure is, not least, connected to the fact that Ukrainian oil sanctions have reached their peak. In November, Russia lost the ability to fully use one of its key oil ports on the Black Sea. The terminal in Tuapse was hit by Ukrainian drones. The oil pipelines had to be shut down, and all this happened on the eve of the planned start of American sanctions against Russia's Rosneft and Lukoil. But they were postponed until December 13th, so the Vitkov-Dmitriev plan appeared at just the right time.
The Russians took advantage of the fact that Donald Trump is in dire need of foreign policy victories because the political and electoral situation there is very complicated.
Trump himself has been going through an internal scandal in recent weeks.
Right now, the personal approval rating of the American president has dropped significantly. Trump would also very much like to clearly show that he is able to fulfill the promises and commitments he made to the public. In the
US, the Epstein Files case has gained a lot of attention. The multimillionaire died in prison 6 years ago. But he didn't take all his secrets to the grave with him. Epstein became the organizer of sex with minors on a private island for the most influential people on the planet. The case materials also mention Donald Trump, though he himself denies these claims and calls them insinuations. He literally explodes when asked about the case. The latest incident became a new scandal. On board the plane, a Bloomberg journalist dared to ask about Epstein. And Trump lost his temper.
Calm down, you pig!
The apologies at the White House sounded strange. It's just that Trump is the most outspoken president. The names of many other famous people also appear there. For example, former British Prince Andrew and former US President Bill Clinton. Now, under pressure from Parliament and society, the publication ban has practically collapsed. Even Marjorie Taylor Greene, once one of Trump's closest supporters, has turned against him. So the appearance of the scandalous peace plan is very timely.
Given the leaks that have appeared in Western media, which concerned only Ukraine, it is most likely that the aim is to spark a discussion around this plan, and perhaps a discussion criticizing this plan.
November 27th is next Thursday, Thanksgiving Day, and the date by which the United States is demanding that Kyiv agree to their peace deal. This is reported by the Financial Times, citing Ukrainian high-ranking officials. Otherwise, they threaten to stop providing intelligence and even selling weapons through NATO. Reuters is now also reporting this, citing sources in the American administration. The president's address to the nation only proves that the situation is extremely dangerous, up to the point of losing our main ally. On the day when Americans carve the turkey, we have to decide our place. At the table or on the table?
And for as long as it takes 24/7, I will fight persistently to make absolutely certain that at least 2 points are never omitted from the plan. These are the dignity and freedom of Ukrainians.
In recent days, the president of Ukraine has held a series of consultations with European partners. In particular, it is known that the mayor put aside all his affairs and had a call with Trump. Zelensky is also expecting to have a conversation in the coming days. At the G20 summit, Europe coordinated its positions and sent them to the US as a counter-proposal to the 28 points. And tomorrow, the EU is gathering 27 leaders for a special summit on Ukraine, according to the head of the European Council. The shock has passed, but the threat has not disappeared. Irina Kondrachuk, Yevhen Litvinenko, Andriy Romanok, and Natalia Stelmach. TSN Week 1+ Marathon. United News?
Just how explosive the environment is that diplomats and politicians are currently operating in is demonstrated by President Trump's latest post on his Truth social network. He accused the Ukrainian authorities of being ungrateful for America's peace efforts and reproached Europe for continuing to buy Russian oil. But both our side and the Europeans continue to look for workable solutions to end the war. That's how Volodymyr Zelensky put it. Based on the reports from the Ukrainian team at the negotiations in Geneva, he stated that the US proposals could take into account a number of elements that are based on the Ukrainian perspective and are critically important for Ukraine's national interests. TSN's own correspondent in Europe, Natalia Fibrik, is closely following everything happening in the course of these negotiations. She is now live with us. Natalia, hello? The President of Ukraine has already shared his information about the first meetings and conversations between the delegations. Maybe you know something more at this point.
Yes, hello, Alla. Indeed, we are following very closely and all the information that can be obtained from Geneva in general. And so we know that the main negotiations between the American and Ukrainian delegations have concluded. And in fact, they lasted less than an hour. And after them, with encouraging statements, came out the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He called these negotiations very productive, and the head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, also said that the talks with the esteemed American delegation were very productive and ended with good progress. And now there is movement toward a just and lasting peace. And Rubio in particular also said the following. Let's listen.
Today's meetings were by far the most productive, meaningful, and significant that we have had so far in the ongoing peace process. However, there is still some important work that remains to be done, and our dedicated teams will be returning later this evening with additional updated information and further details.
And later today, during the course of this evening, at least that's what the Ukrainian delegation announced, there is supposed to be another meeting, this time between the Americans, Ukraine, and the Europeans. And Andriy Yermak also wrote about this. In fact, that's essentially all the information that has come from Geneva at this moment, because the negotiations are truly taking place behind tightly closed doors. A photograph of the negotiations has made its way around the world's media. On one side of the table, we see President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. On the opposite side are the head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, and the first deputy minister of foreign affairs of Ukraine, Serhiy Kazlytsya. And the meeting place in Geneva is the U.S. mission to the UN. And this actually, well, at least for us, is a familiar format. We remember well that negotiations between the Trump administration and Russia took place in this format in January 2022, and that was right before the full-scale invasion. And the journalists standing in front of the UN mission can literally only see the movement of cars and delegations. In other words, there is no communication with the press. No press conferences are scheduled there. However, indeed, certain details throughout the day were provided by the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. He stated that after the first negotiations, after the initial meetings in Geneva between the delegation groups, he wrote that the American proposals may also take into account elements important for Ukraine and that the work is still ongoing.
The Ukrainian and American teams, as well as the teams of our European partners, are in close contact, and I very much hope that there will be results. It is necessary to stop the bloodshed and ensure that the war will not be reignited. I am awaiting the outcomes of today's discussions. I expect that all participants will be constructive. We need a positive result for all of us.
And the composition of the Ukrainian group president or the Ukrainian delegation was approved by the president the day before. As I already mentioned, it is headed by the head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, and the delegation also includes the secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Rustem Umerov, and the head of the main intelligence directorate, Kirilo Budanov, although he was not seen in the photo from the start of the negotiations. Chief of the General Staff Andriy Hnatov, head of the Foreign Intelligence Service Ole Ivashchenko, and First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs Serhiy Kazlytsya. And foreign policy advisors from Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and the European Union also arrived in Geneva. And in fact, these European delegations brought an alternative version of the document, that is, the revisions that Europe proposes to make to this initial plan. And this alternative European plan has already, in fact, leaked to certain media outlets. For example, the newspaper The Telegraph has published it. And so one of the main issues that the Europeans want to change is security guarantees for Ukraine. In other words, the Europeans want to prevent a situation where the war and invasion of Ukraine could, well, start again. It also concerns an immediate ceasefire and monitoring of the silence regime using drones and satellites. There must also be the return of Ukrainian children abducted by Russia. The next principle is the refusal to give up any Ukrainian territories that are currently controlled by the armed forces of Ukraine. That is, the European capitals are actually united here in the view that the war can only be stopped along the current front line. Also, there should be no reduction of the Ukrainian armed forces. And it's interesting regarding NATO membership. It states that this depends on consensus within the alliance, and Ukraine must confirm that it remains a non-nuclear country. And it's also interesting that German Chancellor Friedrich Merz was particularly irritated by how, in fact, Donald Trump, let's say, cozied up to the frozen Russian assets. Trump's previous plan stipulates that $100 billion should go toward rebuilding investments in Ukraine. Half of the profits are supposed to go to the United States, and the European Union is also expected to provide an additional $100 billion. To this, Merz essentially responded that this is a matter between the Europeans and Ukraine. In other words, these funds in principle should not concern the Americans. And on the sidelines of the G20 summit, Friedrich Merz also stated today that he does not, in fact, expect a quick end to this peace process.
I remain, not to say pessimistic, but for now, I am not convinced that the decision President Trump is hoping for will be reached in the coming days. Today is Sunday. President Trump's plan envisions a conclusion already by Thursday.
And in general, the G20 summit that took place in Johannesburg, it turned into a sort of special summit focused on Ukraine. Because at first, Chancellor Friedrich Merz, President Macron, and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer held talks in a small group format. Then Canada, Japan, and other partners joined them. After these consultations, Merz was the first to call. In fact, even before the consultations, Merz called Washington. Then UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer did the same. And the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, made a statement in which she essentially confirmed that those leaks about the European alternative plan in the European media are in fact accurate.
First, borders cannot be changed by force. Second, as a sovereign state, Ukraine cannot have restrictions placed on its armed forces. If these restrictions leave the country vulnerable to future attacks and thereby undermine the security of all of Europe. Third, the central role of the European Union in ensuring peace for Ukraine must be fully reflected. Ukraine must have the freedom and sovereign right to choose its own destiny.
So, as previously announced, we fully expect these negotiations to continue later today as planned. Also tomorrow, Turkish President Recep Erdogan has announced that he wants to call Vladimir Putin. It is also known that on Tuesday, the coalition of the Resolute wants to meet online. They want to gather in order to assess and discuss the results of the negotiations that will be achieved in Geneva. Hello?
Thank you, Nataloshka. Well, as they say in Kiev, it's not the first time for Ukraine to enter a difficult and lengthy negotiation process and to defend its interests. We wish our negotiators good luck and resilience. TSN's own correspondent in Europe, Natalia Fibrik, was in touch with us. Thank you.